And I congratulate the Honourable Lady on obtaining what is an important debate this morning. Anyone looking from outside into this chamber will be rather surprised by the lack of members who are taking part in this debate on this important issue. And I would have thought this was an almost non-political issue which is affecting all of us up and down our high streets up and down the country. Perhaps it's because they feel there's no point in rehearsing these arguments because they're not going to change anyone's mind and there's nothing the government are going to do. Well, I know better than that because I consider the Right Honourable Financial Secretary to the Treasury to be a personal friend of mine as well as the neighbouring Member of Parliament in Mid-Devon, and I know he cares passionately as much about his high streets in Crediton and elsewhere as I do in Exmouth, Budleigh, Salderton, Sidmouth and so forth. And the Honourable Lady makes an extremely good point just at the outset. I would wholly concur with her. In my capacity of outside interest in this House, I went with a company I no longer am involved with to go to the VOA. It was a truly horrible experience, overwhelmingly underpowered officials there, and I know they're an arm's-length body from the government, but I would urge my right honourable friend to look at the VOA and some of the decisions they make, because it's crippling some of our companies, and the onus seems to be on the companies to disprove what the VOA assert, and that can leave companies for many, many months paying outrageously high rates when, in fact, they know, and the VOA know, that at the end of it they will get a rebate. I also know that my right honourable friend, unlike many others in this House, unfortunately, comes from a business background. And he is a successful businessman, so his sympathies will lie, naturally, with the business community. And I think what we're facing here, Mr Gray, is what I've described in a public meeting I had in Sidmouth a couple of weeks ago, which is an unhappy coincidence. It's an unhappy coincidence of the behavioural patterns that we're witnessing in how people go about purchasing goods, and I'm a living example of that, like probably without making a gender-based remark. Well, I'm going to make a gender-based remark. I think the majority of men, like me, probably shop more online than others, but certainly I do the majority of my shopping online. So there's a gravitation towards that, coupled with the issue of business rates, which we're discussing this morning, and then the perfectly hideous decision by successive government to be too loose with granting planning permission to out-of-town megastores, which has not been mentioned so far this morning, which in part are also responsible for the desecration of many of our high streets. Now, Mr Gray, we are not Luddites here. We should not be Luddites here. We cannot turn the clock back. We should remember that many converted mews houses 100 years ago were used for horses and they're now converted, and life moves on and the patterns change and the pattern of life accelerates. So we should move with the times. I was interested in a report the other day which actually showed that the loss of shops on the high street is actually rather less than the public perception. Nonetheless, it is a major issue. I had a meeting in Sidmouth, and I paid tribute to the dogged determination of a local reporter, Beth Sharp of the Sidmouth Herald, who helped bring this together, along with Alistair Handyside, who does so much for tourism in the South West, who quite rightly got recognised in the Queen's birthday honours list. And we had a very good meeting with some of the retailers in the town. And it's clear that this coincidence of events, this unhappy coincidence of events, is having a very negative effect. I mean, I have one hotelier, Mark Seward, at the meeting, who said his rates have increased by 244% in a decade, now standing at £17,000 per month. That's what he's got to make before he pays any of his suppliers, before he pays the living wage to any of his employees, before he does anything. He's got to pay. That's money straight out. And it seems to me that we haven't moved with the times. I had a very interesting meeting with the Honourable Member for Rosendale and Darwin the other day, and we talked about what new initiatives might come from the government in terms of our high streets. I think the accepted wisdom now is the Portus Review, the Mary Portus Review, addressed a certain amount but didn't go far enough, and we now need to look at this in a different way. But it seems to me there are a number of things we can do. In the meeting in Sidmouth, I gave an example. Actually, it was a shop in Sidmouth. which I went to some time ago, selling kitchen utensils, and I said, "How is business?" And they said, "Oh, it's terrible, business is terrible." And I said, "Why is that?" And I said, "Surely when it rains, all the tourists come in here." And they said, "Yes, all the tourists come in here." I said, "Historically, they'd have all come in here and they look at all our kitchen utensils and they think this is marvellous, and then they spend a little bit more time here and they buy things, and then they go home with these wonderful things." He said, "Now what happens is they come in out of the rain and they look at all this stock that this shop carries, and they see something they like, a nice kitchen utensil, so as better to stir their concoctions at home, and or whatever it may be. And what do? They whip out their iPhone and they take a photograph of it. And then they go home and they buy it online. And so the shopkeeper said, all I'm doing is becoming a shop front for these products which I've had to buy anyway, which are now being bought online and undercutting me. And he's got to pay the rates, and the Amazon or eBay, wherever these people buy things from, don't to the same scale. And that seems to me to be at the kernel of the problem. Then there's the issue which we have to tread carefully about, and I'm very proud of some of the charities I'm involved in. I'm Vice President of the West of England School for those with little or no sight, WESC, based in Exeter. I opened their charity shop in Sidmouth, and I'm proud that they can raise money in that way. And we would also support charity shops. The problem is, though, now with charity shops, is that they're selling very often new stock. Historically, charity shops, you gave things to a charity shop, they sold them and not them. That was the accepted thing. They don't pay rates, it's a charity shop. Now, very often they're selling brand new products, very often totally identical to the shop next door, but they can afford to charge less because they're not paying any rates. Now, I think we have to look very seriously, as part of this wider review, about charity shops. Perhaps it should be fixed at a certain percentage, or perhaps there should be other ways of making sure they're not competing with those who are still obliged to pay rates. Now, I think there are a number of practical things that the Minister and the Government can do. First of all, I do think that business rates are in the current way they are charged. They're easy to collect, I know all that, but I think they're no longer fit for purpose because of the changes in shopping behaviour. And I do agree with the Honourable Lady that we have to get smarter about how we tax online retailers. It is extraordinarily difficult, whether you call them tax avoiders or tax evaders. There's more than a semantic difference there. But the point is that they are dominating the high street, or not the high street, the virtual high street, and it is manifestly unfair that there is no levy on them, no taxation on them. And if you did tax them, if you could come up with some smart idea of taxing them, you could either do away with business rates for the high street retailers, or you could seriously support the high street retailers, because you see, it's not just about keeping shops open in our town centre, it's what the community actually looks like going forward. We've already suffered from identikit high streets where every other shop is now a coffee shop. And I'm pleased to say in Sidmouth and some of my other towns like Budleigh Salterton, there are still individual retailers, and that's the way we've got to go forward. Towns have to rediscover local retailers to offer something different other than the multiple chains. So I think we do need to look very, very clearly at how we can find a way of having a levy on the online retailers. Secondly, and this has been done in some towns and cities up and down the country, we need to look at how we can shrink the retail space, because we have to accept we're not going to turn the clock back in how people shop. So very often, the retail side of a town is too big now for the need of the town. So we need to look at how we can shrink, and that's been done successfully in some places, how we can shrink the retail part of a conurbation. And on the back of that, we then need to look at the whole issue of planning, of how we can actually make it much easier to convert formerly retail premises to residential premises, because it's my contention that if you turn some of these shops back to residential, you could have starter homes there, you could bring young families into the town, which would mean there would be a nighttime community, which would in turn give birth to other things such as 24-hour retailers or wholesalers or cafes, whatever it might be. You would bring people back into the heart of these town centres. That seems to me a way forward. We also need to look at the issue of parking. a thorny issue. These towns very often were not designed for cars. They were designed for the odd horse and cart, and now we have people coming. So we need to be smarter about how we get people in and out of these towns, how they're allowed to park. There needs to be much greater flexibility, maybe 2 hours free parking. Again, that's a problem for the district councils, because that's one of the ways they raise money, so we need to look at that as well. We need to get much tougher with our planning about these huge out-of-town American-style shopping conurbations, which personally I think to spoil the countryside in this American-style way. Try and find out a way of making it more attractive for those huge retailers to come into our towns in a way that actually enhances architecture. You can do it without having a huge, hideous store now. You can do it very cleverly. Again, that's been done up and down the country. We should be aware, of course, though, when we look at the big high street retailers like Marks and Spencer aren't changing their entire shopping policy through choice. They're doing it because of survival. And they're closing their stores down, and they're doing more online because that's, as I say, the prevailing mood. And if that doesn't underline the issues and the challenges, I don't think anything else does. So I think the combination of things are hugely important. Shrinking the size of the town, making it easier to change to residential, helping councils with their ability to allow people to come into the town and to park, looking at taxing the online retailers, and looking again at the whole rating system. Changes in the 2017 spring budget meant that businesses with a rateable value of less than £15,000 will not pay the levy. But based on the way it's calculated, bigger stores, of course, have to pay. And I would say one final thing to my right honourable friend. We can't turn the clock back. The Porter's review went so far. I think we have to act very quickly now to make sure that we can preserve and enhance our high streets in the way that I've said. But one of the other issues, and we all get this the whole time, is people hate having services taken away from them. Our bags, what used to be our bags, now our emails, are highly active if something is being taken away from the local community, be it the local shop is going to close, be it the local library is going to close, be it now that the local bank is going to close. Well, it's perfectly clear to me that we are going to see more banks closing up and down the country as we move towards cryptocurrency, blockchain, and so forth. The whole way of doing banking is going to change. We can't stand in the way of that. We can't say we must have the same services we always had. That will be a commercial choice made by these commercial banks quite properly. So you will see more and more banks vacating the high street. Now, in turn, that will give birth to other things that people can do their financial transactions. I don't know what that will look like, but there will be something to replace them. So if you know that's coming down the line, you have to act now to try and preempt it. And I would very much hope, therefore, that the Minister, my right honourable friend, will, with his Treasury colleagues, fulfil what we said we were going to do in the manifesto, speak to other ministers about having a wholesale review based on Porters, looking forward about how we can preserve our high street, how we can help these struggling businesses. Because if it goes on like this, frankly, there won't be any retailers at all. They'll just close one after the other. I don't wish to be alarmist, as I say, the figures are not as bad as people think, but certainly in a town like Sidmouth, we've lost 2 or 3 in the last week or two, and we're set to lose more. And the fact is that no one is replacing them. So we need to be smarter, we need to be cleverer, we need to think in a lateral way to make sure that we tax people properly, of course we have to, but we want businesses to grow, to remain, and to be accessible to our residents.